Picture this: a rusted barbed wire fence under the blinding Pacific sun. Beyond it, rows of women in worn khaki uniforms, their hair tucked into makeshift scarves, their faces drawn thin by hunger and fear. They were Japanese prisoners of war, nurses, clerks, and support staff captured in the closing months of World War II. What did they expect from the Americans who now held their fate? Brutality. Humiliation. A punishment equal to the propaganda they had been fed since childhood. The Americans will treat you like animals, Japanese officers had warned. Some women whispered that they would be killed outright. Others believed darker myths, that capture by Americans meant dishonor worse than death. But when the gates opened, the first image was not a rifle raised in anger. It was a colonel with silver hair and polished boots, handing out cigarettes like a host greeting guests at an unwanted dinner party. The absurdity of the moment was almost cinematic. Women expecting death, only to be offered a light. Of course, not everything was kindness. These were still prisoners in a war of unimaginable cruelty. But the contrasts were sharp, almost dizzying. American colonels, steeped in a military code of order and discipline, often treated female prisoners not as enemies to be annihilated, but as human puzzles to be managed. Take Colonel Kenneth R. Davis, whose reports from the Philippines survive in military archives. He described female POWs as curious subjects of morale, fragile in body but resilient in spirit. His tone was clinical, yet hidden between the lines was a kind of reluctant admiration. The women themselves left fragmentary testimonies. One remembered being handed white bread for the first time. She described its texture as like biting into clouds. Another recounted how American guards laughed at their attempts to use forks, a tool alien to many who had grown up with chopsticks. It was a comedy of cultural collision, awkward, humiliating, but far from the horrors they had braced for. Still, the power dynamic was unmistakable. The colonels held the keys, literal and symbolic. Daily rations, work assignments, medical care, even letters home passed through their orders. And here lies the first great irony of this story. Men trained to break armies were suddenly managing the laundry schedules of captured women. But the colonels understood something subtle. Morale mattered. A prisoner who retained hope was easier to control than one who had surrendered to despair. And so, discipline was balanced with small mercies. A tin of condensed milk here, a spare blanket there. Not generosity, but strategy. Statistics reveal the scale of the challenge. By 1945, thousands of Japanese women were in Allied hands, scattered across camps in the Philippines, Guam, and later, mainland U.S. hospitals. Records show mortality rates far lower than in Japanese-run prison camps. While male POWs under Japanese captivity often perished in staggering numbers, female Japanese POWs in American custody survived at rates that shocked even neutral observers. But survival did not mean comfort. Heat baked the camps into furnaces by day, while mosquitoes turned nights into battles of endurance. Food was rationed, water limited, and medical supplies stretched thin. Yet the women, many of them former army nurses, sometimes treated their own sick, improvising clinics with scraps of cloth and empty tins. American colonels noticed this resourcefulness, and occasionally exploited it, assigning them to tend wounded U.S. soldiers as well. There were also moments of unintended humor. One colonel recorded that female prisoners, upon being given soap, attempted to eat it, mistaking the bars for candy. The misunderstanding became a running joke among guards, though for the women, it revealed their starvation more than their ignorance. Behind these anecdotes lingered bigger questions. What did capture mean for women raised under Japan's code of honor, where surrender was shame? Some spoke of it as a living death. One nurse recalled hiding her face whenever American cameras clicked, terrified her family would see the photographs and believe she had abandoned Japan. Yet even shame bent under reality. Bread was eaten. Cigarettes were smoked. Letters were written home, sometimes never reaching their destination. Slowly, fear gave way to an uneasy rhythm of survival. And the colonels? They found themselves cast in roles they had never rehearsed. Part jailer, part father figure, part reluctant diplomat. Their uniforms, symbols of power, now also carried the weight of mercy. They could crush, or they could cultivate. What came next, however, would test these fragile arrangements. Because as the war ended and occupation began, the meaning of captivity shifted. The women were no longer just prisoners. They became symbols of a defeated empire under the gaze of victors. And with that shift came tensions, temptations, and choices that would echo for decades. The end of war should have meant release. For the female Japanese POWs, however, liberation was not immediate. Instead, they became reluctant actors in a new theater, America's global stage of victory. Imagine the scene. A U.S. colonel, his cap tilted back, standing beside rows of Japanese women as journalists scribbled notes. The prisoners, exhausted, wary, were paraded not with shackles but with symbolism. They were living evidence of American triumph, proof that even the most loyal subjects of the emperor now stood subdued under foreign command. But daily life was less theatrical. Camps adapted from wartime necessity into occupation routine. Women were assigned to agricultural labor, cleaning, and clerical tasks, duties that blurred the line between prisoner and worker. We were not free, one recalled, but we were no longer treated as shadows. Here lies the paradox. American colonels, many of whom had seen unspeakable carnage, treated these women with a peculiar blend of condescension and care. They were enemies, yes, but also women, fragile in stereotype, resilient in fact. The paternalistic gaze of the colonel hovered constantly, turning captivity into something more complex than bars and rations. Numbers reinforce the story. In one Guam camp, out of nearly 500 female prisoners, only 14 died during detention, a survival rate exceeding 97%. Compare that to American women captured by Japan in the Philippines, where death rates reached far higher. The statistics do not erase hardship, but they highlight the stark contrast in treatment. Yet statistics cannot measure the subtler wounds. The loss of dignity, the gnawing uncertainty of the future. Many women feared they could never return home. In traditional Japanese society, a woman who had been a prisoner carried stigma as heavy as iron chains. Some even begged American colonels to keep them abroad, convinced that homecoming meant lifelong shame. In these fragile exchanges, moments of humanity surfaced. A colonel in Guam recounted how one Christmas he allowed the female prisoners to fashion decorations from paper scraps. They hung them in their barracks, tiny stars cut from ration wrappers. For one night, one woman said, "We remembered we were alive." Such glimpses of normalcy were rare but powerful. They remind us that captivity is not only about fences and guards. It is about time stretched thin, about waiting in the echo of defeat. But not all memories carried warmth. One nurse described how American officers questioned them endlessly about Japanese medical practices, treating them as living encyclopedias of the enemy. "We were both prisoners and textbooks," she said dryly. Her words capture the uneasy mix of utility and humanity that define their existence. And then there was humor, dark, absurd, sometimes accidental. A colonel once recorded how female POWs, upon being given chewing gum, swallowed it whole. The Americans laughed, teaching them the ritual of chew and spit. What for the guards was entertainment, for the women was bewildering initiation into the quirks of their captors' world. By 1946, most camps began releasing female POWs. Some were repatriated to Japan aboard American ships, where they stared at the horizon with equal parts dread and relief. Others remained abroad for months, even years, assisting with reconstruction projects. For many, captivity had reshaped not only their bodies but their beliefs. One former prisoner later wrote, "I expected monsters. I found men. Some kind, some cruel, but none as the stories told us." Her testimony cuts through myth, leaving us with something raw. The recognition that war creates caricatures of enemies, but captivity forces people to see faces. The American colonels, for their part, emerged with mixed impressions. Some spoke of the female POWs with respect, others with thinly veiled chauvinism. Yet together they forged a chapter rarely told. A chapter where women, stripped of weapons but not of will, encountered their conquerors not in battle, but in the quiet theater of daily survival. And so, we return to the fence with which we began. Barbed wire, yes, but also something else, a symbol of paradox. For those women, the wire marked captivity, but also life. On the other side of the fence lay uncertainty, hunger, and perhaps dishonor. Inside, under the eyes of American colonels, there was structure, food, and the faint rhythm of routine. The final metaphor writes itself. The story of female Japanese POWs is not one of chains, nor of freedom. It is the story of a tightrope stretched between defeat and dignity. The colonels held the rope, but the women learned to balance upon it. Some wobbled, some fell, but many walked across, carrying scars invisible to statistics. And when history looks back, it rarely sees them. Their stories fade, overshadowed by battleships and mushroom clouds. Yet listen closely. And you can still hear the rustle of paper stars at Christmas, the awkward laughter over chewing gum, the whispered prayers behind barbed wire. Because in the end, the treatment of these women was more than a footnote in war. It was a mirror. A mirror reflecting how even in victory, power is measured not only by force, but by the choice of how to treat the powerless.